also have a really fantastic program lined up as well. Starting with Dr. Sara Broomhall from the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. Sara has an extensive experience at the often complex interface of science, policy and regulation, and currently an executive within the Australian Government's Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. She holds a PhD in ecology and ecotoxicology from the University of Sydney. Dr. Broomhall is highly experienced in international engagement. She was the president of the OECD Joint Meeting of the Chemicals Committee and the Working Party on Chemicals, Pesticides and Biotechnology from 2017 to 2020. She has also represented Australia on numerous occasions as Head of Delegation or Deputy Head of Delegation during negotiations, including 3 under the United Nations Environment Programme. Thanks so much for agreeing to speak here today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Brad. I hope everyone can hear me. I've asked Jai in Brad's team to run the presentation for me because I live in Australia's capital city, so that means my internet is surprisingly patchy. So very grateful to Jai for running the presentation, and you'll obviously hear me ask to have the slides changed every so often. So as Brad mentioned, I'm Director of the Contaminant Standards and Advice section in the department, and we provide technical advice on contaminants of emerging concern or even of emerged concern to regulatory areas in the department. We also give advice on environmental risks of genetically modified organisms to the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. We give advice on environmental risks around antimicrobial resistance for the portfolio, and we have a national regulatory policy function where we serve as national coordinators on behalf of states, territories and the Commonwealth for the PFAS National Environmental Management Plan. And today, Brad asked if I would talk about a couple of the relevant international conventions on chemicals and in a broad sense, how they influence or are used in Australia's chemicals and waste regulatory frameworks. So next slide, please. Terrific. So I'm going to start with actually the longest running and the most diverse work on chemicals internationally, which is actually under the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, most people probably hear about the OECD because we hear it in the news to do with surveys or sort of policy or financial indicators about assessment of performances, you know, rankings of how school children do in maths or, you know, the affordability. But actually the OECD covers an enormous range of issues, and this is its structure. It's surprisingly, for such a large organisation, a relatively simple structure. It has OECD Council up at the top, it has a range of committees under that, and it has a secretariat. And the coverage of the OECD is very, very broad. It's competition, corporate governance, corruption, development, economy, education, employment, finance, green growth, health, industry, innovation, insurance, investment migration, you know, governance, development, science and technology, social and welfare issues, tax, trade, and also agriculture and also chemicals. So when you look at that enormous sort of breadth of work, all of it sits within around 24 or 25 committees. So next slide, please. So with 24 or 25 committees to undertake this work, one of them is actually the Chemicals and Biotechnology Committee. It's had a name change this year to shorten. It had a very, very long name in the past, which Brad managed to pronounce correctly, but it's been shortened to the Chemicals and Biotechnology Committee. And the OECD work on chemical safety and biosafety has been operating for quite a long time, and you see it up here on the slide. Its objectives that you see on the slide is to assist member countries' efforts to protect human health and the environment through improving chemical safety and biosafety. And it's fundamentally about developing harmonised tools and approaches that support both national systems and allow countries to trade amongst each other. So it's really aimed at government decision making and aimed at providing tools and approaches that support governments and industries to bring the data forward and have a mechanism by which to sort of assess those chemicals and biotechnology products. And when I say it's been operating for a long time, it's been operating for 50 years. It's actually considered one of the OECD's most successful examples of regulatory cooperation because it's responsive, it's evolving, and it works across academia, regulators, and industry to bring that expertise to bear on common problems. In fact, it has a very organised industry engagement program called BIAC, the Business, Industry and Advisory Council, which itself sort of organises relevant industry groups to input into the work as needed. So given it's been operating for 50 years, where did it start? You know, what brought it together? Why did it come together? And where's it going now? And so it initially focused on very specific chemicals that were identified as posing health or environmental problems. And the first ones were things like mercury or chlorofluorocarbons, and these were all in the 70s. And the original purpose of the work was to share information about those chemicals with member countries and to sort of jointly act to reduce risks. And this kind of started with a very important early achievement in the sense of global cooperation on chemicals with what's called a council decision to restrict the use of polychlorinated biphenyls, and that was in 1973. This was the very first time that concerted international action was used to control the risks of a specific chemical. So 1973 in the OECD was where we kind of started looking at collective action on chemicals. But of course, that was, you know, one set of chemicals. And with thousands of new chemical products entering the global market every year, well, then OECD countries agreed it could no longer really be one by one, mercury, PCBs. Actually, we needed a more comprehensive strategy. And so it then began developing harmonised common tools that countries could use to test and assess the potential risks of new chemicals before they were manufactured and marketed in countries. And since then, it's established most of the risk assessment processes and tools that underpin regulatory authorities in all OECD countries and indeed worldwide. And I'll give a few quick examples. So next slide, please. And what I've shown up here is a screen grab of what we call OECD Council Acts. So remember I showed the structure, you have OECD Council at the top. When it makes decisions, these are legally binding on members of the OECD under international law. It can also make recommendations, which are expressions of political will, so we call them collectively Council Acts. And the Chemical Committee, or the Chemicals and Biotechnology Committee, has actually some of the largest number of acts under its purview and its responsibility in the whole of the OECD. And this is a whole big list of them. And as you can see, the dates show how long the committee's been operating and how it formed some of its first cooperative work. And there were some pretty pivotal ones that sort of started it all off. Next button click, please, and next button click, please. Okay, this one is the first one that I listed was in 1977, a Council Act on anticipating the effects of chemicals on man and the environment. You can tell the era of the decision with the language. But 1977 is when OECD countries collectively agreed the basics of how you do a risk assessment, and they're pretty much what we do to this day. In the 80s, which you see here with the next one that came up, I've got a bit covered, is countries agreed on ways to share data. And this is pretty critical because up to that point, if a regulator in one country wanted a piece of information on the effects, they would ask for a very sort of bespoke matter. And so companies that wanted to introduce in more than one country had to do bespoke data requirements in each country, each of which consumed large number of animals in animal testing, took a lot of time, took a lot of money. And so there was actually a lot of advantages to trying to find ways to be able to trust the data that was coming forward from industry and to be able to share that data among countries. So in the 80s, we agreed collectively as OECD countries on ways to share data so that we don't need to have an enormous number of different tests on animals in every single country every single time. And they did this by developing the OECD test guidelines. The OECD test guidelines, which I'll touch on in the next slide in a moment, basically set out how to do a proper test in a rigorous way on a standard organism so that the data are comparable, that they're biologically relevant, and they're not confounded. So accompanying this, so it gave us a standard way to do a test on, you know, a standard test species, you know, a fathead minnow or, a, you know, Danio or Japanese Medaka, for example, as fish ones, but standard all the way through in a range of tests, including physicochemical properties and human health effects and environment effects and the rest, is a way to be able to trust that the lab, whichever did that test, is reproducible and reputable. So basically, it also came up with something which we call, you see up there, the decision recommendation of the Council on compliance with principles of good laboratory practice. So this is a method to ensure laboratories conduct that test with sufficient quality and rigour and in verifiable ways that governments know that if they get a test according to the test guideline done in a lab accredited against good laboratory practice, you can trust the data. And indeed, that's what NATA accredits labs against here in Australia, good laboratory practice set out by the OECD. And these tools are pretty fundamental game changers in the field of regulatory chemical risk assessments. They really set out the way for risk assessment as we know it today, and they underpin the regulatory regime in all OECD countries. And today, the work's pretty broad, and it stretches from provision of knowledge and information, assistance with governance, support for capacity building. We do risk management. It covers pesticides, biocides, biotechnology, food standards, nanomaterials, releases of hazardous materials, etc. And you would think after 50 years, why haven't we solved it? But actually, it's a pretty critical need. And as we probably all know, and you know, we're all here at this meeting hearing about very sort of detailed investigations into specifics of certain chemicals, is that the size of the global chemical industry exceeded, I think the estimate was $5 trillion in 2017. And chemicals and plastics fundamentally underpin just about everything in our lives. I think they feature in over 100 out of about 100, don't quote me, maybe 115 manufacturing categories. They're kind of in almost sort of every item and article that we sort of touch in our daily lives, and you've heard some of that today. And when we talk about the size of the global chemical industry, that's not decreasing, that's increasing. In fact, it's projected to double by 2030. So that means thousands of new chemicals being developed every year, and regulators, which actually have to balance what that contributes to the economy and how that is, you know, essential in international trade, have to be able to find ways to assess those chemicals or categorize those chemicals for risks a lot faster and using a lot less animals. OECD has had a lot of developed, probably most of the tools and approaches under the OECD are designed to kind of support that. So next slide, please. So as Brad mentioned, I was really fortunate to chair, or be, they call it be president, of the Chemicals and Biotechnology Committee under the OECD. And it has an enormous breadth of work and can't do that all in one committee. So it has 12 formal sub-bodies, and I've listed them here. And the reason I've listed them here is to show the breadth of work it does. So there's something called the National Coordinators of the Test Guideline Programs, good laboratory practice that you've heard me mention before. There's hazard assessment, exposure assessment. We do work on manufactured nanomaterials, work on pesticides, work on biocides, chemical accidents, etc. You can read it there. And each of these working parties also has subgroups. So when I talked about the OECD only having 25 committees, well, under each of those committees can be a range of subcommittees and sub-bodies, although possibly our committee has the most. And so for each of these subgroups, you can have either none or a few or up to a dozen additional subgroups. So, for example, for those of you who are at the recent CTAC meeting, we had a presentation from our plenary speaker, Dr. Mark Viant, and he spoke about novel assessment methods, and he talked about a work of one of the subgroups called the OECD Expert Advisory Group on Molecular Screening and Toxicogenomics, ECMIST, and that is a subgroup on the Working Party of National Coordinators of Test Guidelines Programs. So it's a subgroup of the committee. And another subgroup, and just the next click please, is that one, is the work organised on endocrine disruptors. So there's an advisory group on endocrine disruptors testing and assessment, which was set up in 1996. And it was designed to either develop new test guidelines or update existing ones to make sure that they are fit for purpose for identifying endocrine disrupting properties. Also developed a conceptual framework for testing and assessment of those endocrine disrupting. And it sets out a mechanism to sort of measure information at different biological levels. So biochemical, all the way to organism, all the way up to population. So you can see in that little example, it's the working party, but then there's a subgroup, there's the advisory group, it also has subgroups under it. So it can sort of, depending on the needs of the work and the priorities of the work, some are long running and sort of permanent, others kind of stand up or fold down as needed. And you can see by that spread of work that that's not sort of the domain of one regulatory authority in each country. That covers, covers the field for pesticides and chemical accidents and biotechnology and novel foods and feeds and industrial chemicals. So here in Australia, we have Australian government representatives on many or most of those subgroups of the Chemicals and Biotechnology Committee. So you have the Industrial Chemicals Regulator on the Working Party on Hazard Assessment or on Exposure Assessment or Manufactured Nanomaterials. You would have the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority participating in the work on the Working Party on Pesticides or the Working Party on Biocides. You would have the Office of the Gene Technology, obviously working in the GROB, the Working Party on Harmonisation of Regulatory Oversight and Biotechnology. You would have Food Standards Australia New Zealand as a long-standing participant on the Working Party on Safety of Novels and Foods and Feeds. And the reason I mention all of those is because that means that regulators in Australia, or at least at the Commonwealth level, are able to draw on the tools and approaches that are developed under these bodies, under the OECD. And they also have the opportunity to bring forward suggestions for collective work to the table. So this is a really active, involved, constantly changing committee that has a constant process of identifying new and emerging priorities, where countries bring proposals to the table, they scope them out, we decide on what is worth resourcing. There's a big process of prioritization, but it's constantly active, and it means that we have a really open framework to sort of do collective work on things that we all sort of, collectively agree are worthwhile. So it makes it a sort of a very productive working environment. And every single one of these working parties is hugely active. There are meetings probably every week of the year of various matters under each of these. And so that kind of workload means that the parent committee, the Chemicals and Biotechnology Committee, has to meet every 9 months just to get through all of the overarching work, let alone all of the subgroups. But the good thing is a lot of that work actually ends up being published in the form of documents on tools and approaches and stuff that regulators and industry and academia use in safety assessments of chemicals and biotechnology. I'm just going to quickly flick through some of them because I'd like to show, and apologies for those of you who are deeply familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, it's just a real chance to see some of the coverage of the committee and the materials that are available. So next slide, please. Great. So here's a screenshot. I talked about the OECD test guidelines for testing of chemicals, and that you can see here, it can It can be something as broad as a fish acute toxicity test, and the one at the top is a fish cell line acute toxicity of a particular cell line assay. And the test guidelines are really the kind of the workhorse of the committee. They're incredibly hotly debated and rigorously pursued. And there's hundreds of them. And they basically, and there's another click just to show some more examples, Jai, just one more click. And basically, thank you. These are the standard methods for safety testing of chemicals, pesticides, personal care products, etc. So when government regulators get data packages to assess with a new chemical, the data are generally, not always, but generally in the form of studies done according to these test guidelines, and they're done in labs accredited according to good laboratory practice. So next slide, please. So aside from the Council Acts that you've seen me listed and the test guidelines, as I mentioned, all the streams of work are really active in generating those new methods and new procedures, new information sharing, new guidance. So I thought I'd list some here that you guys might be less used to, which is work related to the safety of products of modern biotechnology and novel foods or feeds. And this is a list, start of a list of the types of consensus documents that get put together, very large documents that provide really key information on major crops like trees, microorganisms, and modified characteristics, which member countries need in order to conduct their risk and safety assessments. They also publish documents on testing and assessment. So next click, please, Jai. And again, another screenshot with a lot of words, but that's just to show, you know, here we are at publication number 300 and whatever. And it's everything from, well, you see at the top, evaluation of tools and models for assessing occupational consumer exposure to manufactured nanomaterials. It can give peer review reports on very particular assays under test guidelines. There's recently quite a lot of integrated approaches to testing assessment, which I'll go on to it. It can be, here we go, guidance document on aquatic and sediment toxicological testing of nanomaterials. If you do the next click, Jai, it does things such as a risk assessment framework for things like nanotechnology and tyres. So these documents can be really, really broad. You know, they have big documents on how to do grouping, or big documents on how to do read across, or they can do very, very tailored and specific documents to deal with a particular technical, sort of regulatory technical challenge. And then finally, these sort of look a lot like hazard type documents, but it also does quite a lot of work on exposure assessment. So next click, please, Jai. And here are some of the emission scenario documents that it generates. So these basically describe sources, production processes, pathways, and use patterns. And basically they are a way to help countries or anyone indeed quantify the emissions of a chemical into water, air, soil and solid waste. So you see some chemicals used in oil well production, or a recent one on use of aqueous film forming foams in firefighting. So all of these are really useful, quite structured ways in which regulators all over the world, but also industry and academia, if they use it or are interested in it, can use to help sort of contribute to that risk assessment. So next slide, please. And I should also mention, of course, because it's everyone's favourite topic, the committee, of course, also does some pretty focused work, so not just the generic hazard assessment, exposure assessment, but specific work on groups of chemicals or specific needs where countries have come to the table with a common problem and agree on collective work. So up here, I've listed some of the work we're doing on PFASs. The OECD has been very active in the space, and it also does work on things like chemical leasing. And I realise I should get a move on, because I want to kind of touch very quickly on, next slide, please. So if you just click through some of these, Jai, I just want to say really the summary of the OECD work is about supporting ways to do more with less, understanding of effects faster with less animal tests. And IATA is a real focus. So it's an iterative approach to answer a question within a regulatory context. And it ranges from flexible approaches like grouping and read across to pretty prescriptive and rule-based approaches like an integrated testing strategy. And it brings in QSAR, it brings in read across, it brings across in chemico, in vitro, ex vivo, in vivo, and omics technologies. So there is really a lot of work on how to do more with less, how to do adverse outcome pathways, so that we can make decisions on regulatory intervention sort of more quickly and in a more shared manner, sort of more faster to kind of keep up with the sort of developments in the chemical space. And Brad, if you can indulge me, I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking on the Stockholm Convention because I know you were really keen on it. So next slide, please, Jai. Oh yeah, those are the ones we need to click through. Okay, so Stockholm Convention, and this I've had the pleasure of being involved for a bunch of years. And the things that you're very familiar with under the Stockholm Convention or other things under the United Nations Environment Programs is, rather than being broad like the OECD, they're much more targeted to a very specific management and regulatory issue, such as persistent organic pollutants. And we talk a lot about POPs, but there's only about 28 of them listed amongst the maybe, you know, hundreds of thousands of chemicals in use in the world. And that's because they have properties that make them particularly problematic to manage. They can travel long distances, and that makes them a globally shared issue. And the convention sets itself up with a pretty detailed mechanism about the life history of the chemical. So how to control import, manufacture, use, what to do about wastes. It set itself up with a way to check that it's been effective in reducing and eliminating concentrations through the global monitoring plan, which it has comparable monitoring data across all regions. Of course, it has technical assistance and capacity building and governance mechanisms and the like, but it has a very sort of structured way of considering chemicals for addition to the convention and to make it subject to these sort of regulatory controls. And those information requirements are the ones that you hear people talk about a lot. It's things like persistence and things like bioaccumulation and toxicity. So it has Annex D, so next click please, Jai. Up here, it sets out some pretty strict requirements around the criteria that need to be met for consideration about persistence and bioaccumulation and the like. Next slide, please. But what people also don't focus on as much is you need a whole bunch of information on releases, on emissions. You need information on alternatives. You need information on socioeconomic considerations. And next click, please. And Article 6, oops, back one more. Article 6 sets out a whole bunch of requirements around eliminating releases from stockpiles and wastes. And I wanted to highlight those in my last minute because it's those aspects that are most difficult to deliver. It's not like the olden days when it used to list pesticides, which had a really sort of strict and controlled use pattern. These things can have really broad range of industrial consumer use, and they can be in products, and they go to quite different disposal pathways. And if you think about our waste disposal pathways, they're normally structured on kind of manufacturing and use, like municipal waste, construction, demolition waste, industrial and commercial. It is not separated by chemical content of the waste. And so targeting interventions to chemicals in products requires an ability to identify the chemicals and separate it and understand the disposal and be able to control the disposal pathways. So this is the work that is the hardest under the conventions, hardest for all of us, all countries globally, not just Australia. And this is a really active area of identification about traceability and separating products and adequate waste disposal pathways. And so the convention is critical because it sets out those expectations for chemicals that need to be managed in that way, but it is up to every country that is a party to the convention to figure out how to do that. And that is a really active process amongst all countries, including Australia, on how we meet those expectations. But it's great because it focuses our attention on where to intervene in the policy and regulatory landscape and how to affect the best outcomes. Thanks, Brad.